CC or CT foals, then you should ensure that you're sending her to a CC or a CT stallion. Equally, if you're trying to produce an individual that is going to be more suited to the longer distance racing and perhaps turf distance racing, then you want to be looking at the other end of the spectrum. So you can use this information to mix and match your matings to more consistently produce the type of horse that is suited to your operation. So does this actually work if you decided that you wanted to apply this in your breeding operation? Well, this is an example of a breeder who took a decision in 2011. He had all of his mares tested, and he knew the genetic types of most of the stallions because we had shown that the TT horses, as 2-year-olds, the CC horses were, there were greater returns for CC horses as 2-year-olds. And his model was to produce 2-year-olds that he could then sell. So with this information, within a single breeding season, he reduced his proportion of TT foals from a mare, or from a foal crop, I should say, of something in the order of 70 to 80 mares, from 16.5% to 5% in a single breeding season. And the consequence of this is that he almost quadrupled his average take-home in earnings from these 2-year-olds in their 2-year-old season. You can see here the wins to runs ratios from 2013. This is the 2-year-old year of the first foal crop, and how this changed or impacted on the win to run ratio, which doubled in the 2 years, and in the total earnings of those horses over those 2 years. So this information, using genetics, is not only useful for mares, it can also be used to manage stallions as well. In particular, it can help to manage your book of mares, specifically for young stallions, we think. If, for instance, a young stallion, you're trying to promote a young stallion as producing precocious types, and you want that individual to be a leading first season sire, then we would argue that the genetic type, if breeders have the knowledge of the genetic type of that stallion, then that's going to actually be advantageous for that individual, because he'll receive mares for breeding that are more suited to his genetic type, and therefore it's a win-win situation for everybody. We also have farms that have the genetic types for their stallions, and they're able to provide scientifically sound recommendations for mare owners for particular stallions on the basis of the genetic type. So it provides, I suppose, a more rounded or scientifically sound suggestion for nomination for a mare. This concrete information will really only provide clarity and trust then to your clients to increase stallion season sales. There are a number of stallion farms around the world that are advertising the speed gene types of their stallions. This started a couple of years ago with Widden Stud in Australia leading the charge, where they first started advertising the genetic types of their stallions. And it's been incredibly successful. We have a number of other leading farms in Australia, Eliza Park, Swettenham Stud, for instance, that advertise the genetic types of their stallions. And in Ireland and England, a number of farms advertise or make available the genetic information for their stallions to breeders, including the Irish National Stud, Rathbarry stud, Ballylynch stud, Kildangan stud, Dalham Hall, Bearstone stud, and in fact many others that have their stallions tested but keep it confidential. In America, we're delighted that Ramsey Farm and Pin Oak Stud and Swifty Farms are now advertising the genetic types of their stallions, which should make decision-making for mare owners more informed in terms of selecting the stallions for them. So we would encourage stallion owners to advertise the genetic types of their stallions, not only to benefit their own horse, but also to benefit the mares and the breeders that are bringing their horses to them. If a stallion's genetic type is not advertised, it doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't been tested, but please ask breeders if they have been tested, and generally, if they have been tested, breeders are willing to provide that information because it's going to really benefit everybody. Here's an example of how to use the speed gene test. This is Broken Vow from Pin Oak Stud. He's a CT on our genetic test. And here you can see it displayed along with other tools, more traditional tools or pedigree-based tools for breeding, such as TrueNix and eNix and G1 Goldmine and so on. The difference with this is that the genetic type doesn't ever change. It's a test for life. So once it is what it is, and there's no recurring fee to update this on a regular basis. So I need to point out very clearly that the speed gene is an example of a single gene that has an unusually large genetic contribution to a trait. Do you remember I mentioned the heritability and the value of genetics in relation to the genetic contribution to the trait? Well, from our studies and other studies that have been done in Australia, it looks like the myostatin gene has an unusually large, almost singular contribution to the distance trait. And the heritability is up in the order of 80–90%. So this means that really a horse is what it is. Once it's a sprinter, it's very difficult for the management and the environment to turn that sprinter into a successful staying type horse. And similarly, if you have a staying type horse, it's very difficult with all the management in the world to turn that staying type horse into a successful sprinter. But there are other genes, of course, that contribute to performance. The speed gene is one example. It's probably the most, it's the most widely known, it's the most researched, and it's unlikely that we will find another singular gene that has the same effect. But just like in humans, there are many, many genes that are contributing to the various different anatomical, physiological, and metabolic contributions that make up an elite, or adaptations that make an elite racehorse. So what we've been able to do, and other people in other research institutions and companies around the world are doing, is that we're capturing this genetic information for all of the genes that we can now assess across the genome, and trying to identify associations and patterns that allow us to predict other traits. And these tools can be used for improved management and selection decisions based on the use of genetic information. So one example, three examples here for management and selection. The elite performance test, or our elite performance test, captures a very large number of genes that together contribute to the chance or the potential, the genetic potential of an individual to be an elite racehorse, perform at stakes level. It's absolutely not a guarantee, because obviously the management and training and the other interventions that come into it play a role as well. but what we're able to capture here is the genetic potential for elite performance. One that I find absolutely fascinating is what we refer to as a raced-unraced test. It's been estimated that somewhere in the order of 50% of thoroughbred foals don't ever make a racecourse start. What is the reason for that? Well, it may be due to injury, or it may be to a performance-limiting disorder that may have been inherited, or it may be behavioral or temperament trait. We have now been able to develop a test where we can capture that genetic contribution to whether a horse is likely to have a racecourse start and make a prediction of the potential for that individual to have at least one racecourse start as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. For North America in particular, surface preference, we have been able to capture some of the genetic contributions to surface preference. So we can categorize an individual of whether it's suited to dirt or suited to turf, and we refer to these horses dirt pro with the highest chance of being a dirt type horse, dirt, turf, or turf pro for those horses with a very high chance of turf racing. So for those trainers here, this is captured in what we refer to as a racing gene pack, which are tests that are specifically designed to assist the trainer, which include a test for dirt and turf racing, and also for distance, for best race distance. So we've come an awfully long way in the last 10 years since the horse genome was sequenced, but we probably have a long way to go still to capture all of the information that we want to be able to capture. But we're making huge advances in this area, much faster than we ever might have expected. And this is because we have very large sample sets that we can do our research on. We're now able to capture a very large number of genetic markers. So these genetic markers are the T to C changes. So for instance, I gave you that example of a single T to C change in the myostatin gene. Now we're able to use tools that have been developed where we can capture information for 670,000 of those differences at a single time in a horse. And we capture all of that information, which is representative of all 25,000 genes in the genome, and we run it through algorithms, which are novel machine learning prediction algorithms that allow us to make predictions on the basis of that genetic information for a trait. It's important to note that although some of this science isn't published, we attempt to publish as much as we can, and in fact, other research institutes researchers in other institutions around the world are publishing more and more in this area, which shows it's peer-reviewed and clear scientific research that is being done. So just some numbers just to recap. There are 670,000 genetic markers that can be assessed at a single time. We use 48,000 of these genetic markers, so it's not just a single gene, it's not just myostatin. 48,000 genetic markers representing genes in the entire genome. And to date, we have tested 15,000 horses from 29 countries around the world, and subsets of these horses go into the development of the tests. So in summary, using genetics can help you to identify mares or stallions, the ability of those mares and stallions to produce certain types and to produce at a certain level. It can enable you to run a more efficient breeding program that doesn't change necessarily what you do, but reinforces, fine-tunes, and enhances the existing strategies that you have in place. And this will allow you then to get the most out of your breeding stock. They can be trained and raced for what they're genetically made to do, rather than making best guesses on the basis of the pedigree or on the physical evaluation of that individual. And by using this information, we saw how a mare owner had increased their returns by applying this in their breeding population to reduce the proportion of TTs in their breeding stock. But we've also seen stallions' season sales increase through the advertising or of the genetic type. And we've also seen vendors or consigners achieving higher sales prices and higher clearance rates using the information, because that power is in your hands. If you have that information, you can then place horses in sales that are going to be most suited to them and prepare individuals in a way that you can anticipate and have more managerial control over than in the absence of this information. So I just want to come back to a couple of things that I said earlier on. Some of the concerns that breeders or people in the industry may have, which I hope that I might have addressed in the last 40 minutes or so. This is going to ruin the industry, some people have said. Well, I hope that I've explained that genetics isn't a silver bullet. It doesn't tell you everything. It's another piece of the puzzle that you can put alongside all of the other approaches and tools that you use when you're making decisions about your horses. We've been doing this for so long. Why would I change it now? Why would I do anything different? I've been very successful, a lot of people say to us. What I think that you'll also see here is that you can gain a competitive advantage, and every little bit counts. Does this work? We've shown in scientific studies that it works. Does it actually work in practice? And we would contend that yes, it does in real life, outside of the laboratory or the analytics of the laboratory. It does work in real life. There are clear advantages to having the information to be able to place your horses where they're most suited and to manage your own expectations about that individual horse. Some people have said, well, maybe it'll make it harder for me to sell my horses. Well, I would say that actually it won't, because if you have that information yourselves, then you are in control of that. You're in control of the decisions that you make with that information. Any tests that we do are entirely confidential unless the owner has given us permission to reveal that information. So when you send a sample to us for analysis, the result goes back directly to you and to nobody else. Samples can come into us anonymously. We don't need to know the name or the identity of the individual at all. Samples can come into us anonymously, and we can send the results back to you anonymously. So there is no reason that it would necessarily make it harder for you to sell your horses with this information. Finally, I just want to mention that this type of science is venturing beyond performance traits. And it's very likely that within the next 12 to 24 months, there will be tests for prediction of genetic risk for certain health traits that are common in within the thoroughbred population. And a couple of those that are being investigated not only by our research group, but other researchers and research institutions around the world include RLN, or recurrent laryngeal neuropathy, or wind problems, tying up or recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis, bleeding or EIPH, OCDs, and fracture risk. And I would say that it's extremely likely within the next 12 to 24 months that there will be genetic tests for risk or genetic risk for developing one of these genetic diseases. Another fascinating area that we're particularly interested in Plusvital, since it was historically a nutrition and equine nutrition company, is bringing together genetics and nutrition. We all know that we and our horses respond differently to different diets. And we think that one of the reasons that individuals respond differently to different diets is because of different genetic background. So if we can understand how the different genetic background might map to the diet, then we might be able to tailor or individualize diets that are best suited to horses of specific genetic types. So I was delighted to be here today. Thank you very much again for the invitation to be here. If you would like to learn more after today, Stephen is based here in Lexington and would be delighted to meet with any of you at any point. And I think now we'll be very happy to take any questions that anybody has. Thank you very much.
Of the 3 types of genetics that you have, do you hear this, or is it on or off?
Yep, you push it up. Yep.
Of your 3 genetics types, is there one that would enhance the physical development sooner than the other, or is there no effect on that?
So I missed, is there one that enhances?
The physical development of the foal sooner?
Yes.
Or is there no effect?
Yes, no, the CC type develops, physically develops faster than the TT types in a number of different ways, but in particular the muscle mass.
What was the cost of doing it, and what, you pull a hair sample, or how do you obtain your?
Yeah, well, I'll let maybe Stephen answer the question in North American.
So our tests are ranging from prices starting at $350 for the speed gene test, and along with that we developed a couple of different types of packages depending on what your goals are, whether it be training, racing, management and selection of various different breeding stock, and the prices vary accordingly. In order to test, what we need to get is a 5 ml blood sample taken in a purple cap K2 EDTA tube. It's then packaged and shipped via FedEx using our own FedEx account. We cover all those costs there. Once it arrives in our lab, depending on what tests you want to get done, the speed gene test can be turned around within 1 week. But some of our tests are more comprehensive, like what Emmeline mentioned, the elite performance test, the race done race tests, or our premium package, which covers all of our tests. The turnaround time can range up to 21 days before that information is returned to you. And as soon as the test results are ready, you will receive a test report that covers all of your results, and then I will arrange a meeting to come and sit down with you and go through the results, and hopefully tailor and be able to discuss how to best use these results within your operation.
Was there any statistical difference between the C and T gene being inherited by the sire versus the dam?
Is it easy to figure out if the C or the T is inherited from the sire or from the dam? Is that the question?
Was there a difference in performance ability?
Okay. Yes. So the question is there a difference in performance ability whether the C is inherited from the sire or the dam, or the T inherited from the sire and the dam? We've done some preliminary studies on this. It doesn't seem to have a significant effect. That a CT arising from sire C or dam C and vice versa, the performance attributes seem to be the same.
So based on the, right here. So based on the information that we've received today on CCs and TTs and so forth and so on, as a consigner and a breeder, it seems like you're saying that we need to kind of avoid the TTs for earnings and sale prices.
Well, I think it depends on what type of horse you're trying to sell. and into what market. I think that that's dictated by the market, and if the market is dictating that you need to be producing more precocious, early maturing horses, then yes, that is the case. If the market is dictating that they want later maturing, more staying types, then that's the type. But I think you know the answer yourselves as to what the market is dictating, and really what you're doing is you're responding to, as breeders, you're responding to the market. So what we're trying to do with this is just to enable you to do that more efficiently and effectively. I don't think that I could specifically say, yes, you should be producing more CCs or more CTs, but the data seems to suggest that if that's the type of horse that you're trying to produce, a more precocious, early maturing type that's going to perform well as a 2-year-old, then yes.
Yep.
Yes, I was wondering, of all the leading sires in the world, let's just say, you know, in Europe and Japan, America, whatever, do you guys, what percentage do you think you actually have the hair samples on or have worked those studs up? Do you have that number or an approximation?
So as I said, a lot of our testing is anonymous. So we don't know for certain how many we've tested. We know that we've tested 15,000 horses. Of those that we do know the identities of, I think something in the order of 3,000 or 4,000 of those are stakes race winners. And I would imagine that many of those are males. We do have a list of, I think, 200, is it on the website? 200 stallions that are listed on our website with their genetic types. So yeah, it's probably a small fraction at this point that we are aware of, but we're not aware of all of the horses that have been tested. People are using it internally and have been for quite some time over the last couple of years, particularly in the early days when people weren't really sure how it was going to play out or whether it was going to be to their advantage to disclose the information. So a lot of people were keeping it very close to their chest. But I think now that people are much more comfortable with the idea of genetics, we've been doing this for 7 years or so now, that people are more willing to disclose that information. So I would encourage anybody that's interested to ask the stallion managers, have your horses been tested, and can you have that information, because that's going to be beneficial to everybody. So I would say a small fraction at this stage. I'm not entirely sure. I don't have the exact number.
Trainers in Europe seem to be using the tests to determine where they run their horses or how far they run their horses. Is that true?
Yes, so it was interesting when we first started out. It was in fact the breeders that were first mostly interested in the genetic information, so they could manage their mare population better. And I think probably breeders might have intuitively understood genetics better or recognized the value of genetics because of the pedigree. But now we have a lot of trainers in Europe. I think some examples. Do we have any specific examples of trainers in Europe?
Yeah, there's most recently was the biggest example of the use of our speed gene test was with Galileo Gold after he won the 2000 Guineas. Hugo Palmer. They were trying to decide whether or not to send him to the Derby. They weren't sure whether he would stay the distance of 1.5 miles. And the guys behind him were kind of pushing him and saying, "Do you know what? We'll send them to the Derby." But Hugo was kind of reserved and didn't really think he'd get the trip. So they came to us and asked us what the chances would be if he was a CC, a CT, or a TT of staying that Derby distance. So we ran the speed gene test on Galileo Gold, and it turned out that he came back with as a CC. And Hugo asked us, what chance does a CC have in Europe of winning at the distance of 1.5 miles? And from our research population, a research sample set that we have of over 15,000 horses, we came back to him and said that horse, as a CC, has a less than 1% chance of having its best win distance of 1.5 miles. So subsequently, they reneged from entering him in the Derby. They pulled him out of the Derby, and then went to the St. James's Palace Stakes in Royal Ascot, where he subsequently won over a mile at his optimum race distance, and now going into this year, he's finishing up as a strong stallion prospect. Actually, just on that, just mentioning the Derby, I just have a tweet here from Craig Brogden that just asked me, is the Speed Gene a good handicapping tool for the Kentucky Derby? And just having looked at our research sample set there from North America, in which we've tested a couple of thousand horses. I looked at the results of the CCs, particularly in those CCs who have won from stakes races up.